Okay, I've got the live. Okay, this is John Kruger, the president of the Estes Valley Library District. This is June the 3rd, 6:30 p.m., and it is our monthly study session. We have all of our board members present, and we have staff, Claudine Perot, Cindy Seckman, and Joanna Stensland is handling our recording. And Finley is also with us, although we can't see her because she's enjoying a meal. And we have our guest, Lori Graves with Graves Consulting, who will be our primary presenter tonight. Hope everyone can hear me clearly. Okay. So I'll turn it to Claudine to more formally introduce Lori, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, John, and good evening, everyone. Lori, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I will be very brief in saying we were very fortunate to learn about Lori's consulting services through the town of Estes Park. I reached out to all the various taxing districts last year when I was assigned to look at compensation more thoroughly, and I found the towns to be particularly organized and clear. And Travis said, "Oh yeah, we always use Lori Graves." So Lori has done this for how long now, Lori? Have you been doing this work?
I've had my own business for about 5 years. I started Graves Consulting about 5 years ago, but I've been doing HR and comp for, I usually just say 25 plus because I don't want to go over 25.
Well, the product you gave us was incredibly helpful. You gave it to us a little earlier than the deadline, which enabled us to include some of those corrections in time for the 2021 budget. You and I have not spoken much since January. We've touched base a little bit in preparation for this meeting, and I thank you for your advice, and I turn the floor over to you.
Okay, before we do that, let me just make sure everyone is clear. Since it's a study session, we'll not be able to take any action tonight. And so we'll have Lori do her presentation that we all received copies of, and then we'll open it up for individual questions and all. So during her presentation, it might be best if everyone mutes themselves so we don't have any feedback and so forth. So Lori, thank you, please.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the presentation, even though I think you all do have copies of it. So let's make sure this is working. Is that visible? Awesome. Okay, thank you. So I don't have a very long presentation. This is a pretty high level overview of the work that we did primarily through Q4 of last year. And as Claudine mentioned, wrapped up kind of just after the first of the year. And I was incredibly appreciative to be recommended by the town and have an opportunity to work with the district. I specialize in public sector compensation. And as I mentioned, much of my business, the vast majority, is actually in Colorado. And I am fortunate enough to work in a lot of the beautiful towns and cities and counties within Colorado, but I have a particular fondness for Estes Park. And so I have been very fortunate to be able to work with several of the organizations there. And I'm hopeful that I'll actually physically get to travel there again soon. So appreciate the opportunity. And what I'm going to go through is a pretty high level overview again of the deliverables, the process we undertook, high level, some of the findings and the recommendations so that you can see. I believe you've seen the copy of the full written report. So there's a lot more detail embedded there. And I'm really just going to cover the highlights of that. I will also do my best to try to remember to pause every couple of slides so that if you do have questions, there's an opportunity to ask them. Sometimes I can get on a roll and I'll forget that part. So I will do my best to leave an opportunity. So with that, big picture, this is probably not a surprise, but overall, the intent of the project was to ensure that the Estes Valley Library District has an opportunity to recruit and retain the top talent that you need within your organization, and to do that by making sure that they're paid competitively to market, and that there is an opportunity within your pay structure to provide for career progression and wage growth. so that people don't just come there as a job, they can actually come there as a career. And I think that's an important aspect when you're building a pay structure. The scope of the piece of it that we were going to be providing is to provide recommendations specifically to update the pay structure that you had in place based on current statistically valid market data. And to do that from a market area that is as appropriate for the district as we could possibly get with the data that we had available, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in addition to presenting recommendations for pay structure and where jobs should sit on that structure, we also talk quite a bit about recommendations for implementation and for ongoing maintenance, right? Because our goal when we do these projects is to not only deliver what you need to be current to market right then, but to maintain and to be able to keep current to market and to do that as independently as possible so that you don't have to budget in every year, right? Reaching out and using consulting services. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to go through a fairly high level overview of really the primary elements of the project, the process steps that I go through in this type of a project. And I always start with kicking it off with a meeting with the leadership team, no matter how clear I think I am up front, right, based on a written proposal. There is no replacement to me for being able to hear firsthand from a leadership team what is happening in current state, what your specific concerns are, and to be able to get a good kind of broad understanding of the organizational structure, right, and the positions that exist within the library. Because as familiar as I may be with libraries, there is always some uniqueness to each organization that I work with. And I do have a little bit of an added benefit that one of my part-time consultants has a master's in library science and spent her career in libraries. And now she helps me on a variety of things, but I always have that knowledge that I can tap into, which is helpful. So we began by doing that, and then we facilitated a discussion about let's understand where we're going to get our data sources and how we're going to make sure that we can really define your comparable market. Because, you know, being able to say, well, we feel like we're most like this library, but only using 1 or 2 or even 3 libraries as your data point is not really going to give you statistically valid data, right? Whatever variation they have in their system is then going to come into your system when you have fewer data points. So we talked about that, and what we specifically used, which we'll get into a little bit more, is the Employers Council. The district is members of the Employers Council, which is a fabulous resource for all public sector entities within Colorado. I use them extensively. We use their 2020 pay survey data, but then in addition to that, we incorporated some specific data that the internal team was able to collect from 4 comparable library districts that weren't included in that Employers Council data. So it gave us a little more breadth and depth to the data. And when we pulled that information out of the Employers Council survey, I mentioned that we used what we call the library district line. And for those of you that probably aren't familiar and don't have any reason to be familiar with the way that survey is laid out, it breaks up the information by region, it breaks it up by budget size, and it breaks it up by organization type, meaning city or county or district. And while size or budget might feel like the best comparator, that generally makes the number of organizations that fit into each category so few that the data still has quite a bit of variation. So when you use the library district, it's basically looking at library districts of all sizes in all areas and regions throughout the state. We know that some of those are going to be significantly larger than you. We know that some are smaller. They're in different cost of living areas, but it is the broadest, kind of most statistically valid data line. So that's what we chose to use. When we pull that information, what we're looking for from that survey are actual wages being paid to incumbents that are performing the same work as the employees that you have in your organization. And I say that as opposed to just pulling pay ranges, right? Sometimes you can just look at a pay range that somebody offers and say, oh, well, our range is similar, so we must be at market. But that doesn't mean you don't know where they're paying their people within that range. So I like to use actual wages paid. It feels like it's a more valid comparison. Any questions on this before I move on? Oh, okay.
I have one more, if it's okay. Just from a process standpoint, did you meet or talk to anybody at those various libraries, or was it just mailed out? Or did you even or did we just wait until the council pulled it all together?
Right. It's a great question. So what I used primarily was the information that was pulled together by Employers Council. And so it was not what I would call a custom survey. A little bit of what you're describing would be a custom survey. And that is something that I do for some of my clients. It is obviously a little more time consuming and quite a bit more expensive. And generally, Employers Council does such a good job of collecting and validating and scrubbing data that if that is available, I recommend that over a custom survey, though we did supplement it with, as I mentioned, some of that internal information that had been collected by your team.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So as we go through the rest of the process, I really kind of mentioned this first bullet point. We pulled actual wages being paid as opposed to ranges. Sometimes I do make adjustments to the benchmarks. When I look at a job in the survey and I think that it is similar to the job that is being performed there by the employee or the position that you have, but I know it may be different because maybe you as a small shop have combined that skill set with a couple of other skill sets, whereas in a larger organization, they might focus in one singular area, or you may have a higher certification or education requirement. There's a variety of reasons why I would adjust benchmarks, but I don't just match title for title. And I don't just look at one and say, oh, well, that's close enough, right? I try to make it as specific and as good a apples to apples comparison as I can. So we were able to match all of the district's positions to external data sources. And from that, we created what I would call a market average for each role. So by pulling all these data sources, matching each job, we created a dollar amount that became the market average rate for each job. Then I designed a pay structure, and I say based on best practices. We'll talk about that a little bit more because I'll share the pay structure and a little bit of the kind of the design of it. There are some things that I think are really important when you're building a pay structure. Range width, right? How far it is from the minimum of a range to a maximum of a range can make quite a bit of difference in your ability to hire and your ability to retain. It also makes a difference from an affordability standpoint. Building a pay structure that has ranges that are equidistant apart also makes it easier when it comes time to need to upgrade a position or add a new position. You have a structure that is not going to have such a large gap between pay grades that it is difficult to change them. I designed a pay structure. I recommended a placement for all of the positions that exist within the library. And I think a couple of potential future positions we talked about, recommended a placement on those pay grades for those positions. And then from that information, based on what the incumbents were currently earning, calculated the initial financial impact, right? And I focus on initial there because the only thing we calculated up front was, are there any employees who are below the minimum of the new proposed range? And the initial financial impact would be just bringing those people to minimum. But what we know is that that's not the total financial impact, because if you only did that piece of it and didn't look at everyone else, you would create wage compression, right? You would be bringing people up who were maybe newer or had less experience without adjusting the people who had been there longer, and it creates compression. And that's what comes in the additional phases of implementation. And again, we provided some guidance and some recommendations for what that phased-in implementation could look like and what it should be based on. And we also talked quite a bit about ongoing maintenance of the pay structure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the pay structure that we built, and then I'm going to show it visually. And again, you've probably seen this. We built a total of 16 pay grades, and there wasn't any real magic to that number. It was simply starting with a pay grade that had a midpoint that was the lowest of the market averages of all the jobs you have, and building up to a pay grade that is as high as, or maybe a little bit higher than your highest paying job, so that we knew we had a structure that all your jobs would fit in. And while we built 16 pay grades, we knew we would not have positions that would fit into every pay grade. They're simply there and available to use as things change in the future, right? I built that pay structure with range widths that were 40% wide. So again, that distance from min to max, which is That really, I would say, generally, if I build pay structures in a larger organization, the narrowest I would usually go is 35%, and the widest is usually 45, maybe 50 for very high level senior executive type positions. 40 is really a kind of a good sweet spot to give you enough flexibility to move people through a pay range, but not such an incredibly wide range that the bottom is really not usable. It's too low to be able to hire anybody in, or the top is unattainable, right? So that's why it matters. And previously, you had an existing pay structure that was based on market data. It's not like this was completely new to the organization, but it was just built with a little more variation, right, in the range width or the distance between them. I did build it with midpoints that were 10% apart. It'll probably be a little easier to explain that when I show it visually, but again, the idea is when it comes time, when a particular job might grow in the marketplace faster than others, and it may need to be upgraded on your pay structure, you don't want there to be such a big gap that there's a huge jump to get to the next highest pay grade. You also don't want them so close together that there's so much overlap you can't really tell one from the other, right? I did build it as what I call an open range pay structure, which means there is a min and a max, but there are not predetermined steps along the way, right? Step plans used to be more popular in municipal government. They're still fairly popular in public safety, like police and fire. But for the most part, most people have moved to an open range philosophy just because it gives you the flexibility that you need to move people through their range and maintain budgets, right? Again, we talked about not all the pay grades are in use, but they're there. And the way this structure is built, it's a very simple calculation. And so it will be easy over time to adjust the entire structure as the market shifts. So I'm going to put the visual picture of the range up here for a second, which again, you've probably seen, and then pause to see if there are any specific questions on this. Nope. Okay. So this is honestly just a visual representation of everything I just talked about. These are the grades that were created. I have them in both an annualized and an hourly calculation, whatever's easier to look at. You'll notice that the lowest grade, the minimum of the lowest grade, is set at the Colorado minimum wage amount, so that you would not have anybody that would be below the Colorado minimum wage. These grade numbers that I assigned are honestly completely arbitrary. You can assign any type of a label to the pay grades that is appropriate for you. I just don't start with grade 1, only because history tells me that nobody likes being in pay grade 1, right? That just feels low. So you could make it 10, you could make it 100, it could be alphanumeric. And this 40% again is the distance between the minimum and the maximum. 10% means each of these pay grades, the midpoint of each grade is 10% higher than the midpoint of the grade just below it. So you have a nice kind of even framework. So with that pay structure, the high level impact of implementing this pay structure is that there are some positions that changed what I would call relative position on your classification listing, meaning maybe they are a little higher or a little lower than positions that they might have been grouped with before. Because again, this is based on current market data and things change, right? So not a lot of huge departures from it, but I didn't look at it as where are they now and they should stay in the same order. I really let the market data guide where they should be placed on the structure. Once we did that, we discovered there were really only 2 positions that had a total of 3 incumbents that were below the range minimum, and not by a lot. So the total estimated annual impact to bring those 3 incumbents to range minimum was right about $8,000, right? Which to me says the pay structure has been pretty well internally maintained, because I would have expected to see probably a bigger departure from market. But obviously that was being looked at, right? That was being paid attention to because things were pretty well within market. What I mentioned before is that while the estimated financial impact is $8,000 to bring to minimum, I'm certain that you have other incumbents in positions who are probably lower in the new range that we've created than their tenure, experience, performance would probably warrant, right? That they should be. So that's That's the ongoing phases of implementation. They're within range now, but are they where they should be to really be able to say we have a market-based pay structure? Okay, so implementation. We've talked about this a lot, and what I tell many of my clients is that what I do is the easy part, right? Because implementation is the hard part. All of this is great when it's simply academic and it's on paper and the numbers all work out and I can tie it up with a bow and hand it off. Implementation is where it lives or dies, right? So I do try to spend a good amount of time making sure I give people some at least guidance on how to create that implementation plan. And the first step, as we talked about, is just placing everybody onto the new pay structure and then bringing anybody that's not at range minimum to range minimum. And that work has been done, right? And I think that Claudine will probably cover some of this after that, or maybe already has. The next step is helping determine where they should be in the range. And the first thing that I recommend doing is calculating what I call a Compa Ratio. It's not what I call it, that's what it is. It's a Compa Ratio. And a Compa Ratio is simply a numerical representation of someone's pay in relationship to the pay grade they're in. So in other words, if I'm in a pay range and my pay range, the midpoint of my pay range is 50,000, and I happen to make 50,000 a year, I have a Compa Ratio of 1, which means I am right at the midpoint. If I am below 50,000, I have a Compa Ratio of maybe 0.8, right? Or 0.85. If it's above, it might be 1.1, right? Or 1.15. So it's a quick, easy visual way to look at a large group of people and quickly determine roughly where they are in their pay range, which makes it a lot easier to look at people individually and then decide, is that where they should be, right? So running that Compa Ratio calculation, which has been done. And then the tricky part, this is the part that takes the time, is saying, okay, let's determine where everybody should be in their pay range based on the methodology and the guidelines that the district has laid out in their pay philosophy, right? And normally those guidelines are based on education, prior experience, tenure with the organization, and many times performance, right? Not everybody has pay systems based on performance, but it is generally an input to most of them. So that's a combination of factors that take a little work and a little thought to individually look at each person and decide what is appropriate for them based on those factors. And then really the fourth step, and I say fourth step and beyond, is to make the pay adjustments that you identify that, but to roll it into however many budget cycles it takes to stay within the guidelines, right, and the budget limitations that you've set. And it may be that it's not a huge number and you're able to do it in your very next pay cycle. It might be, for some organizations, it could take 4 to 5 years, right? I've worked with clients where it had been a long time since they had done a market study, and it was going to take quite a while to get everybody to where they should be in the range. And lastly, what I generally recommend, this is where it becomes internal choice, right? There's not a way for me to say exactly what is right and wrong when it comes to pay philosophy and guidelines. What I like to recommend is that you have documented guidelines for how you are going to place people in pay ranges and move them through pay ranges. But I tend to shy away from a very strict formulaic approach that can be very black and white and not allow you any type of leadership or management discretion. Because while those sound wonderful, right, and they sound like they're going to eliminate all of your pay disparity issues, people and situations in the world are just not that clear cut. And, determining how much experience somebody has sounds like a super easy process, but it's not, right? I want to work in a library, but I haven't worked in a library before, but I worked in a bookstore. Does that count? Or I worked in a retail outlet and I dealt with the general public, but it wasn't a library. There's just a lot of fluidity that comes into those types of decisions. So we tend to recommend guidelines. And then ongoing maintenance, right? This is clearly important because what you don't want to do is spend all this money and time and effort and sync everything up to market and then not look at it again for 5 years and suddenly discover you're below market again and you've got to go through this process. So maintaining the pay structure, in our view, your pay structure, the entire pay range that we showed, should shift either annually or at least biannually, according to how the market has moved in your area. And there are a few ways to decide how the market has moved in your area. And organizations sometimes tag different things. Sometimes they'll use consumer price index. Sometimes they'll use overall wage adjustments as predicted or provided through an industry association. One of the things that I tend to lean pretty heavily on is back to that Employers Council data that we used before. One of the things Employers Council does when they collect their salary survey is they also ask all of their member organizations, what is the percent that you expect to increase all of your pay ranges by this year? And what is the actual percent of pay increase to employees that you are projecting giving? So they're able to aggregate that data and provide it out. And it becomes, I think, a pretty relevant guideline for most of my Colorado clients, particularly public sector, because Employers Council does look at both public and private, but they're very heavy in public sector. I think that employees should move through the pay range. So it's important to keep the pay ranges themselves tied to market, but it's also important to make sure that your employees can move through their pay range, right? Not just always stay in the same place. And again, basing how they move through on your pay philosophy or those compensable factors we talked about, right? Like tenure and experience and performance. So the idea, a market adjustment that moves the entire pay range up, and a pay increase that moves you through your pay range, both of those are pay increase opportunities for employees, right? If I increase the entire structure by, say, 1.5%, just to keep people at the same place in their range, they need to get a 1.5% increase. But now I need to move them through their range, right? That's usually based on merit, right, or performance. That's another opportunity for pay increase. Some organizations do those at the same time. Some of them do them at different times. Sometimes one on a common date and one on an anniversary date. There's not a right or a wrong. It's whatever makes sense for you culturally and administratively, right? I would say is important. And then we do recommend an external market study. I say at least every 3 years. I'm not trying to just generate future business here, but what happens is that when you make kind of an estimated market structure adjustment, you're probably keeping pace with market overall, but there are always certain jobs that move faster or slower than others. And many times what you need to do is you might find a job that needs to be upgraded on your pay structure because that particular job may have moved faster than the rest of the overall market. Or there might be increased competition in your market for one particular type of skill set, and you really need to upgrade that to be able to stay current. Those are the kind of things that are usually identified through an external assessment. The beauty of it is once you have it, once we've done it one time, it is a lot quicker and easier to update in the future, right? Because the structure is built, the job matching has been done. And then the conclusion of the project. So we went through all of that and we concluded with this detailed overview of the process and findings in the form of a presentation. We did a full final written report that had a lot more detail. We produced a copy of the pay structure and the classification listing, which simply says these are the jobs in which pay grade they go in, and then provided, again, significantly more information and detail on implementation and maintenance. And that is what I have for my presentation. And now I'm hopeful that I can answer some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Lori. I will step through and give everyone an opportunity to ask questions of clarification, and then we'll have a little more time for individual discussion on any of these areas. Claudine, you're going to share your other summary as well at some point?
I will, John. I would like to ask Lori, I love the PowerPoint, but I'd love to see people's faces now, if you don't mind. Thanks.
Yeah, great.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you. Okay, so let's, I'll just call on you one at a time and see if there are questions or specific comments about the presentation. I'd like to start with Pete, please.
Sure. I had one question I meant to ask Lori a long time ago, but I forgot. The Library Council data, does it go outside of libraries? For example, an IT person or an accountant who is an accountant, is an accountant, is an accountant. Do they still stick with libraries, or do they talk to other industries?
That is a great question. And no, it is not the data for positions that are not specific to the library is aggregated from all of the respondents that they get, public sector and private. So for all of the jobs that are not library specific, I did use Employers Council data, but it is not specific to libraries. So it would be a more competitive number across multiple industries, things exactly what you mentioned, IT, HR, right, accounting, infrastructure type of jobs. It's a cross section of all business.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Lori, excuse me, Lynn, you have a question.
I do. How does location factor into this? I mean, we living in Estes Park continually here. We have housing is expensive. It costs a lot to live here. How does that factor in?
Well, so we didn't factor it in directly. What we did was we specifically chose a very broad group. We stayed within the state of Colorado, and we chose that library district line because we know those districts exist in higher cost of living resort areas, but also in others as well. And they tend to balance each other out. So I didn't go in and do a specific adjustment for cost of living. However, it's one of the things that we consider when we think about the width of a range is that you need a little flexibility, particularly in more entry to mid-level jobs. You need flexibility to be able to bring people in a little higher in that range to account for the things that you're talking about, right? So rather than build it in overall, it's accounted for more through that opportunity to have flexibility of where you bring people in.
Okay.
It. You're muted, Claudine.
I just wanted to reiterate something Lori told me, Lynn, that helped me to think more clearly about that very question. When I first said, what are we doing, what are we not doing with this study? And I wrote it down, Lori, I hope you feel complimented. Market value it's market value with consideration of internal equity. This is not an affordability exercise. That's outside the scope of Lori's work. And that becomes something that if the board were interested, we can spend time on, but we did not pay Lori for that. Right. Okay, go ahead, Lori, thanks.
I was just going to say, what I'm remembering is that some of the data that you had been gathering early on had a lot of information about, right, housing cost and cost of living and this concept of, kind of a minimum living wage. And that is incredibly important work to do, but it's a little bit outside of traditional market study. I think you do the market study and see what that tells you, and then you use that type of data to decide how you want to position yourself within the market.
Okay.
Thank you. Beth, any questions, comment?
Yes, Lori, thank you. It was great to see all your thinking. It was super clear. I really appreciate that. Tell me if this is an inappropriate question, but I'm curious about how bonuses play into this structure. And maybe it's not the right question or in your scope, but I'm super curious about that.
No, it's actually a great question. And what we're looking at here is cash compensation, which does tend to include in other organizations if they pay annual cash bonuses. So many times the numbers that they're reporting, not all the time, but many times it would include cash bonuses as a part of it. So this is considered kind of an all-in number. That is not to say that some of these organizations don't then offer, what I call at-risk pay on top of this base pay. But because most of this data is municipal, and within a municipal setting, bonuses are the exception to the rule. There are very few municipality governments that pay bonuses on a regular basis. That's not factored in here very much. Some who pay it would probably report it. Most in government and in public sector don't rely heavily on at-risk pay.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else, Beth? No. Okay. David, how about you?
John, I don't have any specific questions. I do want to thank Lori for a very clear and understandable presentation. It made a lot of things clear to me, and I think it was a good exercise for the library to go through.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you. And Kay?
Couple of the questions were already asked, and the other questions are going to be directed to Claudine. So I'm nothing right now.
Okay. And Finley, do you have any questions, clarifications?
Actually, my question was asked. Beth was the one that did it, so it's great. I'm good. Thanks, Lori. It was valuable for our organization. I'm with the Funds and Foundation, and it was helpful for us to get a sense for our executive director. So thank you so much for that input. That's it.
Okay. I have, I guess, a little clarification or your strong opinion or not on the timing of adjustments that are made. You mentioned the two possibilities, and then we've been doing annual, first of the year. Do you have a strong opinion on moving that to anniversary dates?
I would say that I do have an opinion, but it is probably based more on administrative practicality than anything else. Prior to starting my business, I ran HR departments in large organizations, and what was administratively easier and simple, we were less likely to mess up. And in my view, doing common date pay increases and doing them all at once was a lot of work, but it was administratively easier and less likely to make a mistake. So I tended to like that approach better, and easier for employees to understand. Doing things on anniversary date makes total sense, and it's still a very common practice. But as the world changes from what's going on in January to what's going on in November, it can feel very different to an employee. If I get my pay increase in January, but let's say my health benefits, they renew in June or July, and that number goes up significantly, right? I'm not connecting the two, but if my anniversary date happens to be in July, right, when the benefit costs went up, I'm connecting those two, right? So sometimes it's just psychologically easier to pick a common date.
Okay. And the other one I have is we do have some pay grades in this that we have no one in, no positions. Do you see these as opportunities for promotion, but still with the same classification? So someone moves through their existing pay grade and they're at 1.5. Is it appropriate consideration just like a 17? Maybe a supervisor moves up to an 18 because of the kinds of roles that they're accomplishing and so forth.
So, I think the answer is yes and no. If you are increasing the pay grade that someone is in simply because they have been in that job a really long time and have reached the top of the pay grade, I don't know that I would say that's the most valid reason, because the reality of it is every job has a market value and every job has a cap on the market value. So, you're not going to pay the absolute best library shelver that you could have and that you might have for 40 years. Probably not going to pay them six figures, no matter how long they work there. So if it is simply a function of, hey, you're at the top of your range, I want to move you to a different pay grade, maybe not. If what you're saying is you've been in this job a long time and you've really grown the job and you've expanded the span and scope, and now you do a lot more things, and that provides more value to this organization than it did before, then absolutely that's a reason to upgrade a job.
All right, that's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you. Okay. I'll look and see if any other questions came up in anyone's mind. Pete?
Just one more about this timing of the dates and stuff. And Claudine and I have talked about this a little bit, but on those companies that Lori, that you've worked for or that you've surveyed, do you find that they focus heavily on, when they give the increase, that it's close to the performance evaluation date as much as possible? For example, do they go to a common performance appraisal date and then usually do their adjustments after that? Or do a lot of organizations don't do that, and it might be 11 months since their had their performance appraisal and they get their increase. You know, you can see theoretically that could happen.
Agreed. And, you know, so first it depends on whether or not an organization chooses to use, you know, performance or merit as the way that you move through a pay range. And I say that because some do and some don't, right? In corporate America, more use a performance-based pay system, and they do a performance evaluation, which is many times very formulaic and produces an actual number, and that number correlates to an exact percent increase. And when they do that, generally the timing is so that right after the performance review, you get the increase, right? If the way you move through your pay range is simply based more on tenure and assuming that you're meeting the expectations of the job, right? As long as you're here every year, you're going to get your kind of merit increase through the pay range, but it's not tied to a specific performance review, then I think timing is less important. And, you know, that probably potentially could get us down a bit of a rabbit hole that I'll try to spare you, because I probably do have some strong feelings on that idea of linking pay and performance that may not align with your internal philosophy.
Thank you.
Okay. So you're aware, I presume, in talking with Claudine and all in getting ready for this, that what we've been doing in the past, the library went many years with no increases at all. Financial reasons for that. When in 2013, after 2013, and we got a mill levy increase, we made a commitment to a 2% increase kind of across the board. We had some other adjustments here and there, but that's pretty much been it. Of course, that has not been a consistent as far as the CPI is concerned. So any comments around that?
I think that practically, first and foremost, your budget has to drive what you can do with your pay structure, right? Whatever you build doesn't matter. You've got to be able to pay for it. It has to fit your budget structure. And so knowing where market is a different thing from being able to say, I'm going to keep my pay 100% aligned to market all the time. I still think it's important to know where it is, even if you can't afford to always stay there, because it's the difference between, kind of actively accepting risk or passively accepting risk, right? At least you want to know what the market is. And I do think that it's important to make that commitment, but it's also important to have a system of transparent communication with your employees where they understand, here's best case scenario and here's the practical world we live in, and here's how we meld the two.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Okay. I think time then to move on to Claudine's sharing on her summary.
Lori, I always enjoy listening to you. Thank you. You speak in complete paragraphs.
Imagine that.
And you're welcome to stay with us throughout the entire thing, Lori. So please feel free to, if you have the time.
To you, I'm happy to stay. So just let me know.
Thank you.
Happy to have Lori stay. But Lori, if we go too long, please also feel free.
Awesome.
Thank you, to log off. So part of the time, just in review for everyone, Pete Johnson has a background in HR, and he very politely said he's a superlative generalist and an expert in not in any particular aspect of it. Pete, you can correct me if I misunderstood, but he gave me a bit of a quickening as it applies to how to best implement Lori's recommendations in the compensation work. So it did force me, I think in a really, really effective way, to look at the pay philosophy, by the way, which is approved by the board. I think you might have read in the executive summary. This is what we've relied on for years, but our budget held us to maybe a more frugal approach to compensation. And even after 2013, John, I would admit to being perhaps still a bit more frugal than our budget warranted. We were, I think all of us who were here before the mill levy election can agree we could not have predicted quite a lot that's gone on since. So we happen right now to be in a place where we can look at this the curb, of your policy and to operationalize it. So I can go through very briefly what Pete, I'm going to say, turned the hose on, and I did my best to capture his lessons in our, we met for about a month. And I have a longer guideline version that I use with the HR team. Okay, so what you see is the one-page executive summary, but please know I am quite well supported by Cindy Seckman, who has run probably more calculations than she had time for. So Cindy, thank you. And to Joanna Stensland, who really has become our de facto attendee for Employers Council Continuing Education for HR. So the three of us together, we meet about once every 2 weeks as well, just to make sure we're following the law, following our own policies, and beginning to develop practices that genuinely implement this comp plan. So allow me to turn John and the board to what it all means. In the summary that I sent with this, with the attachments, it was a reminder that for the last, I'm going to say 15 years, we have attempted to target 65% of expenditures towards personnel. And I asked Cindy, who spent a number of hours, what are our peers doing in terms of percentages? And the reason why I'm always focused on it is it was at one time a very handy way to tell the board, I'm going to focus on the operational details, you focus on the budget curbs. Regrettably, as you see the 3 bullet points in that email, we are still awaiting apple-to-apple comparisons. And Kay and anyone else who may have questions for me, I may on occasion defer to Cindy because she'll have had more direct communication with the CPAs that work in other libraries. But you asked for, when are we implementing this compensation plan? And I will admit to not reactively, but very thoughtfully kicking the can down the road a few months is my recommendation. And the reason being, right now, we are still not at a full complement of staff. And with being such a small organization, for example, we have hired 2 supervisors in the last quarter, one of whom is new to this level of work, one of who's been doing this work for about 10 years. Their impact on the budget is very different. And since we have 5 more positions to fill, it will help us know where that impact is going to be. Nonetheless, even if we put the remaining empty positions at mid-level, it moved us this year to 70% of expenditures. I don't have a curb from you as the governing body, and the curb I offered to you does not have merit right now for me because I can't find out if it's a best practice among my peers. So there may be other ways for us to look at what you do relative, from the governance level to what I do operationally. And perhaps if we had time today, that would be where I'd like to spend a little time. So if we were to move everyone based on what Pete has taught me in our training sessions, the philosophy really has shifted from, John, your recognition of our annual COLA adjustments that averaged around 2%, sometimes below what COLA actually was, but we kind of stuck to it, to now that we have years of service determined, right, based on this compensation study and that sort of clarifying the philosophy, we know it's going to be about $105,500 just this year. So that would compound over time.
Okay, so I have a question there.
Yes, I was monologuing, please.
Yeah, you say 105,000, that's salary and benefits, but that assumes starting at when? If we had started in January for a full year?
So Cindy calculated that for me, anticipating that question, John. And what she would say is, even if we moved everybody this year, right, include this 105,000, we would not exceed 97% of the budget. Like she said, we would already be a few percentage points down. So John, it would be to implement June 1st, right? If we implemented it right away.
Okay.
Even if we hired the open positions as
Yeah.
late as August, right? But we hope to have them sooner.
Yeah.
It would exceed our existing budget, right? That 70% would exceed what we expected to spend. But because of the delay in the hiring, we would still be under budget for the end of the year. So thanks, Cindy, for anticipating John's question.
So I just need clarification.
Yeah.
That
Yes, Kay.
105.
Yep.
Is that an annualized number, or
Yes.
is that anticipating the implementation date of June 1, July 1, whatever?
Okay, that's annualized.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's important. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's what I was getting at.
Right. It is
Thank
not 200,010. Yeah.
you.
Okay.
It is annualized. But it would bring us to 70% of this year's budget, which brings me to the other bullet point, John, and then I'll bring it back to you,
Okay.
is I don't want to bank on, and Kay, I'm very sensitive to your past comments. I don't want to bank that property values will continue to behave the way they have this year. However, I would still like to acknowledge that having we discussed this perhaps on camera or off, Pete, that, I did my first property protest because it went up 50%. So what is this going to do to our budget? I don't know, but we will know in the end of August.
Mhm.
Hence the kicking of the can. Okay. So I'd be very happy to review the guidelines summary that I provided. I would be happy to have Cindy in particular. Joe may have something to share, but any calculations assistance. The Finance Committee, for example, did ask if we could review some of the data that we received from our neighboring districts in the Estes Valley. So there's a lot of data available, and we can keep crunching it. And I don't mean that dismissively. I'm saying I really would like to wait till August until we know what the projection is. But I'm open to any of the board's questions broadly, but specifically about what would a curb look like between the board and the director. Thank you.
And Claudia, before we go any further, that 105, just to be sure, includes benefits.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, it does. Mhm.
Yeah. The actual salary adjustment is probably itself would be closer at about 70,000 or a little less from
Right.
my calculations anyway. Cindy might have a different number. Cindy, you can come on for this discussion, by the way.
Okay.
Hi. We just hired a couple of key individuals. How do they play into this, compensation?
Yeah. Did you use this information in the hiring and salaries?
I did. I will say, however, that my use of the formula of tenure, years of service, and merit will come later, was informally done, as it has been for 12 years, informally done. But they actually fit in quite nicely into their positions. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So what I'd like to do now is actually open it up for comments around two elements here. One is, as Claudine was referring, curbs, the 65% of budget versus 70% of budget for staff salary and benefits. And the other is implementation timing. So your thoughts and comments. As I said before, we cannot take any action tonight. We could bring this up again as a item for our June meeting. I think Claudine's asking us to wait until September board meeting because we don't get the Larimer County numbers until after our August board meeting, I don't believe, normally.
Correct.
So timing items there. And again, I'll just work through on my screen. Pete, you come up first.
Okay, my only comment is I like the idea that Claudine's proposing, which is to push it out a little bit to allow some more study time. But what I'm suggesting we push it out for is to give the new supervisors some time to understand the system and use this, whenever we do give the adjustment, use this as an opportunity to educate the employees on how the process works. And, like have meetings with employees and give them the basics about salary ranges and comp ratio and, position and range and cost of living and all that kind of stuff. So that will make their lives a lot easier going down the road when they're actually having the discussion with the employees. That's all I'm saying. And that's going to take some time to get it ready. And you got new people. I'd wait till the new people came in and get the two new supervisors very involved. But that's I don't want to get into what is it, operations, Claudine, instead of governance.
That's all right. Okay. Lynn. Your
Yeah,
comments.
Claudine, I know that the staff is familiar with the fact that this has been going on.
Yes.
Do you, if they've seen, here's something we've been working toward, it's June, we got a presentation, does it present a problem to staff to then have that delayed? Are they expecting something to happen now?
Thanks, Lynn. I think everyone, without having asked them, I can imagine everyone would love to be compensated at a higher rate immediately, right? That's just assumed. I would be surprised if anyone is expecting an immediate response after this board meeting.
Okay.
However, with that stated, I think something to share with you by the end of this year is a summary of our exit interviews. Why did so many folks leave in the last year and a half? And informally, we know some of them were exceptional health issues. Some of them were COVID, why risk public service? But I would say a good number of them were unlivable wages. So you're going to see that, and it's not. I think it's important to share with you that not who, but of the 10 people who left, 3 said this, 5 said that. So Lynn, it is an issue. Your question on affordability and my quickness in saying we didn't pay Lori for that, this really is the crux of the employee issue at this time. So we now have a waiting list of staff for the bookstore apartments.
Oh, wow.
So I don't mean to, when I put it on the shelf, I meant to put it on the shelf, not to diminish it. It's big enough for us to spend a good deal of time on. But so Lynn, that's my way of saying I've probably shared the Graves results twice with the staff. And what I think I need to do broadly, like, hey, everyone, here's the information. Hey, everyone, we're going to be talking about it at the board level. Hey, everyone, if you were below level, we've corrected you in January. But what I haven't done is Pete's recommendation, which he did say to me offline. Really work intensively with the supervisors, really make this process as transparent and understandable as possible. Upgrade our appraisal process so that there's a relationship between your appraisal and your merit increase. So I realize that's a long answer as usual, but no one is expecting it. Everyone is welcoming it.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Good, Lynn. Okay. Beth.
I think my question is maybe similar to Lynn. So it makes sense to me to kick the can and wait till August. And then I can see why that, but why would we not? And so I think that's what you were answering in Lynn's question, but I wonder if there is an additional perspective or something within that that would be important to look at.
Beth, are you saying a short-term correction now?
Could be. It could be a short-term correction. I was thinking of those temporary curbs and things that, there's a lot of different ways to do that. But I'm thinking, usually when it's super clear that August makes sense in this situation, I will get blinders. And so then I'm like, oh, it's August. So is there something outside of that? And I think Lynn was really touching on what's the expectation of employees. Is there something else outside of that we maybe just want to bring into the conversation? Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
I heard you, Beth. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, and I need to think about it, but why don't you, we have a lot of witnesses here to make sure that might be an opportunity for us to have some dialogue at the staff level.
Okay. Good. David?
Yeah, Claudine, I do agree with your approach of implementing this in stages as more information is available, particularly with the personnel issues you're talking about. My question for you, though, is what is the 70% number main concern for you? Is that a psychological barrier or is it a public perception number?
Yes. Sorry,
Okay.
David, I was being cheeky. Please go ahead.
No, I kind of assumed that, but I just kind of wondered if that's your main concern about that. Because my main concern is to get to the levels that we need to be to attract the right employees, and that those percentages are definitely a consideration, especially for public perception. But I didn't know if there was more to it than that.
No, sir. That is the whole kit and caboodle. This is a long in the tooth reply, but when I started here and I was a first-time director, what I used, I was a bit of a mascot to the front range finance officers, and they knew I was just trying to understand a little bit more about what they did well, and they tended to be larger libraries that could afford a CPA at the time. And it was so helpful to me to see how they broke down their percentages of expenditure. And I'll just take a moment, John. There was a stark difference, David, between municipal percentages and, thanks, Lori. Goodbye. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Lori.
Thank you, Lori.
Between municipal and district libraries. The reason being, most of the municipal libraries had their IT, HR, and other administrative tasks were outside of their budget. Their facility expenses were very low because the city, sort of like ours, took care of the grounds, but also the building. So two things were going on. You know, we weren't able to compare apples to apples between cities and city libraries and district libraries. But once we sorted that data, it was revealing. That's where Cindy and I are right now. We're sort of rebooting this process among our peers. And I'll just take a big guess, Cindy, and you can disagree, please, is the numbers we're getting back. 70 was bad, I thought, David, but it's really bad compared to some of the data we've received, which is averaging 44% towards personnel. And Cindy asked some follow-up questions, and what it's revealing to me, we're just going to confirm it, is they're including their debt service for various bond payments in this operational delivery. And I think I need to be more precise in my language. What are your operating expenses? Please exclude all capital, or capital direct funding. And I realize I've gone too far here with this, but David, under normal circumstances, I was really ready to come to you with a 68% curb as my target. But when I saw how many of my peers are below 50%, I decided to pause and get a little bit more clarity on how we can't be double. That's outrageous. We have to sort the data more fully.
No, that actually clarifies a little bit with that of what they're including in their percentages. So yeah, it needs to be clarified. Absolutely.
Thank you. Cindy, anything you would add to that?
Not at all. You did that perfectly. We did have one come in at 56% was the highest, but again, I'm not sure they're not calculating it the same way we're calculating it, and we all need to be on the same page in order to compare. So
yeah, okay.
Thanks,
Thank
Cindy.
Kay?
Yeah, I guess a couple of things. One is I like the idea of waiting to see what our initial numbers come in August, because I feel very strongly we have to live within our means. And I understand we have a reserve, but I really don't think we want the reserves to be used for day-to-day operations, which, are going to be our salaries, which is the biggest part, but our ongoing programs. I really see those reserves are for those one-off projects, or maybe, improvements on the facility. Because if we start dipping into those reserves to pay now, they're going to be gone. And so I really think, we got to live within our means. And this is going to give us an indication. I don't think any of us expect a, 18% increase in, I don't, 18% or 20% increase in our revenues. So let's see what they are. And then I think also the timing of would come into play is I do believe giving performance reviews and then very soon after giving raises, it ties it all together. So if someone is doing really well and there is cash there, that means a lot more than having to wait 6 months. And that will also tie in with our budgeting process, so we will know what we have to give. And this is going to become, I think, a bigger and bigger issue over time if we want to continue to increase and our revenues don't go up at the same rate. That means some things are going to fall away. And what are those things? And that's always a budget discussion. So I think the timing of waiting just a little bit really could follow through. And then to add to Pete, give us time to do it properly and comprehensively.
Thank you. Any response, Claudine? Or
I tend to take Kay's comments very seriously.
all right, thank you.
Thanks, Kay.
Anne, would you like to make any comments?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay. So my position is one that we did this survey and information effective at the end of last year with that data. If we wait, we're going to compound the adjustment differences. I would very much like consideration of moving ahead with some limited amount of adjustment to get us moving in the right direction. Kind of what Beth was saying is where I had been thinking. I hear everyone's comments about wanting to see what the county assessor says our income's going to be. I guess I've been around long enough to see that it doesn't go down, and it's going to go up, and it's going to keep going up to some extent, maybe not at the same rate every time. I just really am concerned that we keep postponing, and we're going to turn around and have to do another level of consideration, whether it's survey or other information. And then we're going to be balking at that one too. So I would really encourage some kind of movement soon. As I said, we won't have the information for a board meeting until in September. So you might just well wait till the end of the year if that's going to be the case. So I think our staff deserve better consideration than that. Yes, Claudine. Claudine had a response.
Thanks, John. Kay was ahead of me.
Okay.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Kay.
First of all, I don't think anyone's balking. And if my comments implied that, I apologize. That wasn't my intent. I also heard Lori say sometimes it takes years to bring this into play. I don't want to lose good people, but I also want to make sure that when things are applied, they're applied appropriately to the individuals. I've heard we have new managers. They don't know their staff yet. To give across the board, we may not end up being able to do any more than that. And then our good people aren't going to be compensated. So I'd like to just make sure there's some thought process in it.
Well, yeah, I agree with the thought process, and I wasn't thinking of across the board kind of adjustment necessarily. I think it needs to be individual. very much so, based on the experience elements and so forth. What I'm saying is make an initial movement towards whatever our goal is now and work on it over the years to get us where we want, fine. But we have a survey with some boundaries now. Come next year, those could move. And they aren't going to
It's
move
going to be a
down.
moving target forever. I mean, it's always moving.
Yeah. Okay. That's my
Mhm.
my position. That's all.
Just to be clear, I'm not, I haven't been around long enough to really make a recommendation on date. My point was mainly we just seize this opportunity to educate the employees on the process.
I agree with you there
June,
wholeheartedly.
July, August, as long as we do that, that's something I could help Cindy and Claudine and Joanna with in terms of talking points for the supervisors. That's all I was really talking about.
Right. No, I appreciate that. I think some education for staff is really needed. My other point is, in moving now, we've already hired new supervisors using this kind of data and information, and no one else is getting it. That just really doesn't set well with me, I guess. I think others ought to get some portion of that fairly soon, with the kind of education and understanding of where we're going overall. That's all I have.
Well, John, fortunately, as Cindy did some calculations, the budget can absorb some of the short-term things you're recommending. So definitely not against that. I just agree with the others that we need a process to do this right now, correctly right now, and move forward is fine with me, John. And I think we're fortunate to have a budget that it could absorb a little of that right now.
Thank you, David. Claudine, you have some responses?
Well, my response, John, is to put Cindy on the spot to help me recollect the scenarios that she and I worked on. So Cindy, if you can't do it right now, it's okay, I couldn't. I wanted to address one of the questions on, I think, in the room, which is, we originally started by working out a 68% scenario adjustment for this year. And that was going to originally be my recommendation until, as I told you, I was astonished by our peers reporting. So at 68%, that, let me put it this way, in review, if we had, we have a no budget constraint scenario, which was, everything to the wind, we're at just under, it's 69.7%. Would be this year's budget, and that's at full employment, right? That's at as if all positions were occupied, right? So just to let you know, it's the intent of it that I was trying to manage, not the impact of it in this year's budget. Okay, so the 68% scenario, which seems very subtle, it's only 2 points down. Cindy, can you remind me? We calculated that. How far under budget would we be this year if we did the 68% in August? I'm just wanted to throw that out for the board if you're able to do it.
When I did the calculation regarding budget, which one did I use? That's a good question. Give me a minute to look, okay?
Okay.
And if
you don't have to.
No, yeah, we don't have to have all of that tonight, but I think those are, if we're going to continue the discussion at the board meeting, I think some of that would be very helpful to have, maybe even in advance of the meeting if possible.
Okay.
So the board could look at impacts on the dollar figures.
John, I want to let you know that there were 2 parts that I wanted to make sure I was clear on with the board, and thank you all for the time you've given on this topic. The kicking the can was also a bit of boldness, I think, on our part, which is if revenues increase as dramatically as we believe, they may, right? What did I say? If property values increase, we may be able to do this in 1 year. I just wanted to make sure that that was clear, is it's not a delay that we then implement over 3 years, regardless of our revenue probable increase, but to say we're done with it. And now we can focus solely on merit and cost of living adjustments as required. So I wanted to make sure that that wasn't lost in this calculation, which is we're not attempting to delay correcting compensation. We're looking to simplify that correction and to do so accurately with the unspoken, unidentified curb between the board and me.
Okay, but you're still looking at not trying to get everyone to a same percentage of their grade, but do it based on their experience,
Correct.
their performance, and so forth.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Those adjustments have already been calculated.
Calculated. Okay.
Yep, those are
Good.
already in the formula.
All right.
Mhm.
So can I be sure I understand that roughly 70% puts all the employees, at least to the extent you've got some vacancies, but
Right.
it puts everyone where you believe they belong in their grade.
Correct, Lynn.
And if you moved everybody where you think they go, that's 70%.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Of this year's budget, were we to fully expend it.
Which we won't
Okay, right.
this year, but it would carry over, as Kay was saying.
Correct.
Of course, it carries over to next year, and that's what it would be next year
Yes.
and future years if we continue to have that kind of movement.
So thank you, Lynn, for helping me to make that clear.
I think you had. I think I just.
Well, we want
I
everyone
just wanted to make
as,
sure I understood.
Yeah, we want everybody as clear as possible on this. Okay. Is there anyone else that has any particular comments on these two elements? Okay. Is
John?
there interest? Yeah. Is there interest in continuing this discussion with a little bit more input and data at the June board meeting? Nods, yes or no, or words?
Is there a chance that you were talking about the comparative data where other districts look radically different. Is there a chance that you would have had time to sort through that before the board meeting?
There is a chance, Lynn, but you have my word that once Cindy and I have this sorted in a way that we can stand by, you will be the second to know. So we will endeavor to deliver it as soon as possible. Just a reminder, your June meeting, you have another guest, it's the auditor. My guess is the entire meeting will be taken up with that conversation, but I will deliver any changes to the data that we're holding back on. I mean, wouldn't it be great if the county delivered the assessment early? That would be a miracle. If that were to happen, you will be the second to know. Cindy, I think that's fair. We can only move as fast as our colleagues deliver.
Sure, we understand that. The audit, it certainly is a major element for the June board meeting. Our history is that doesn't take a whole lot of time. So
okay,
we will put it as a tentative to have some further updates if you have the kind of numbers that you were talking about possibly having for impact, depending on when we would start any of this implementation, partial or otherwise. And if we don't have time, we'll postpone it to August. Fair enough? Okay. One last opportunity if anyone has any comments or thoughts. Appreciate very much everyone's input and your perspectives. It's good to have a diversity of perspectives expressed. And I've tried to work to where we give that opportunity. So I hope you feel like you've had that. Study session, we'll tell Joanna that she can